So hello everyone, and hope everybody's having a great summer so far. It's my pleasure to take the next hour or so to discuss this report with you, entitled Building Bridges, Perceptions and Realities about the English-Speaking Communities of Quebec and their relationship with French in Quebec and bilingualism in Canada. A little bit of background about this study that we conducted. Really, it stemmed from an idea a couple of years ago, and really at our office, the Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages, we noticed that there was growing public debate about the English-speaking communities of Quebec, about their place in Quebec, and also their interest in the French language and French culture. So that led us to conduct this study, which was conducted over 2023 and the early part of 2024. And finally, this study was published in the spring of 2024, so about a year ago. This study was conducted by Dr. Robert Talbot, the Manager of Research at the Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages, as well as by his team at OCAL. I'll also mention that this study is published online on the Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages website, and so it can be accessed there at any time. So without further ado, I'd like to first speak to you a little bit about the Commissioner of Official Languages, just a brief overview of his mandate and his areas of activity. So as many of you may know, Monsieur Raymond Théberge has been the Commissioner of Official Languages of Canada since January 29th, 2018. The Commissioner's mandate is to take all measures within his power to ensure that the 5 main objectives of the Official Languages Act are met. And really, the Commissioner has 2 main areas of activity. There's the promotion and the compliance area of activity. So on the promotion side, it includes a number of activities, notably education through research, studies, and awareness activities. So this study was part of our promotional activities, and this presentation also fits within the category of promotion activities. In addition, we work with federal institutions and other organizations, various levels of government, and we work with official language minority communities, of course, throughout the country. We also do a lot of monitoring to ensure that language rights remain a top concern for leaders in society. So that covers the promotion area of activity. Now, on the compliance side, the Commissioner of Official Languages is an ombudsman, which means that he receives and reviews complaints, and if required, he also investigates those complaints and makes any necessary recommendations. Now, as some of you may be aware, the Official Languages Act was modernized in June of 2023, so approximately 2 years ago. And with that modernization, the Commissioner of Official Languages was granted new tools to ensure that federal institutions comply with the Official Languages Act. And so he has now a more garnished toolbox, which includes tools such as the power to enter into compliance agreements with federal institutions, to issue orders to them, and so on. The Commissioner's mandate is to take all measures within his power to ensure that the 5 main objectives of the Official Languages Act are met. And of course, you have them here on your screen. So one objective of the Official Languages Act is to ensure the equality of English and French in federal institutions. By the way, these objectives of the Official Languages Act are in no particular order here. A second objective is to support the preservation and development of official language minority communities throughout Canada. A third is to advance the equality of English and French in Canadian society while taking into account the diversity of provincial and territorial language regimes. A fourth objective of the Official Languages Act is to promote the future of French in Quebec. So this is a new objective of the Official Languages Act. It was included in the recent modernization. So there really is a particular emphasis in the Act on promoting and protecting French in Quebec, and not only outside of it in official language minority communities. And a final objective of the Official Languages Act is to clarify the official languages obligations of federal institutions. So now that I've given you a very brief summary of the Commissioner's role and mandate, I'd like to jump into the heart of today's discussion, which is the Building Bridges report. And I'll start by going over this quote that we heard from one of our Anglophone participants in our focus groups. The individual said, "I guess we believe what we want to believe about each other." speaking of Anglophones believing what they want about Francophones and vice versa. The person went on to say, but I think the issue with having pre-existing prejudices and biases about Francophones or Anglophones or allophones is that it just doesn't help anything. Relationships don't get better if we just continue to believe any of our prejudices. I like to start with this quote because it summarizes a lot of what we heard. This study is really about deconstructing false perceptions about communities, about the English-speaking community of Quebec. As this person rightly points out, pre-existing prejudices, whether it's about one linguistic group or another, don't help anything. And so really that's what our study sought to do. It's really to deconstruct persistent myths about the English-speaking communities of Quebec. Now, in terms of the objectives of this study, a first objective was to explore certain myths and perceptions about the English-speaking communities of Quebec, abbreviated here by ESCQ, and also to identify potential solutions to deconstruct these myths. A second objective was to inform the Office of the Commissioner's reflections and messages on the English-speaking communities of Quebec. And finally, this study also sought to nuance the perspectives of opinion leaders and target populations regarding the English-speaking communities of Quebec. In terms of the methodology, there were three main components of this study. So the first main component was background research. Essentially, we looked at census data and public opinion research surveys conducted by the Department of Canadian Heritage and our office, the Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages. So that was really the backbone of the study. It was just to get data about the English-speaking communities of Quebec. A second component was looking at qualitative research. So we conducted 6 90-minute virtual focus groups in December of 2023. Now we have here in the table a roundup of these virtual focus groups. So on the Francophone side, we rounded up 2 Francophone groups that were composed of people living in the Montreal or Gatineau areas, as well as 2 other focus groups that were conducted in French with Francophones, composed of people that were outside of the regions of Montreal and Gatineau. For Anglophones, we had 1 focus group composed of people in Montreal and Gatineau, and a different focus group of Anglophones composed of people from outside of Montreal and Gatineau, for a total of 40 participants that participated in these focus groups. That was the second component of the study. The third component was the quantitative research part. So this was essentially a telephone survey of Quebecers that was held in January of 2024. As you can see, a total of 1,005 people were surveyed. And here we see that 885 Francophones were surveyed, whereas 120 Anglophones were surveyed. These are all Quebecers, by the way, people living in Quebec. And one of the reasons why there were so many more Francophones and Anglophone surveys was because, well, naturally in Quebec, there are more Francophones than Anglophones. Moving on to a couple of key findings that came throughout the study, so throughout all 3 components of the study. A first finding was that myths and misperceptions about the English-speaking communities of Quebec persist among Quebecers, but the situation can be improved. So we found that, yes, there are myths, misperceptions about the English-speaking communities that persist among a good proportion of Quebecers. However, the positive thing to retain is that there are solutions or there are measures that we can put in place to help deconstruct some of these false perceptions we have about each other. And we'll get around to that towards the end of the presentation. These measures that we could put in place to help improve common understanding between Francophones and Anglophones in Quebec receive large support from both Francophones and Anglophones. That's really positive. Also, it's encouraging to note that English-speaking and French-speaking Quebecers appear to get along well individually. So most Anglophones and Francophones appear to get along quite well at the individual level. This could be Anglophones and Francophones in Quebec interacting as colleagues, as members of the same family or extended family, as neighbors, and so on. So that was also encouraging, and that came through quite a bit, not only in the qualitative focus groups that we held, but also in the quantitative component of the study. And finally, coming back to public understanding and how it could be improved, there are a number of different measures. But first of all, what we do is illustrate constructive examples of the English-speaking communities of Quebec engaging with the French language and French culture, Francophone culture, and also backing this up with factual data. Something else we could do to improve public understanding between Francophones and Anglophones in Quebec is to foster more positive in-person interactions to the benefit of Canada's linguistic duality more broadly. So more on that at the end of the presentation. Now, if we turn to the first component of the study, which looked at census data and public opinion research surveys, what we found is that most English mother tongue Quebecers can speak French. So 71% of English mother tongue Quebecers are bilingual, and a majority of them use the French language at work or as a language of instruction at school. They speak it at home or have it as another mother tongue. And so this is robust data from the 2021 census. What's encouraging about this is that not only do most English mother tongue Quebecers speak French, right, 71%, but they also use French in an important facet of their life. So that's encouraging. Also, we found that most Anglophone Quebecers engage in cultural activities in French, and they are as supportive as Francophone Quebecers of statements in support of Canada's linguistic duality. Canadians outside of Quebec also support the Official Languages Act, and we know this from public opinion research surveys conducted by Canadian Heritage and ourselves. So when we say that most Anglophone Quebecers engage in cultural activities in French, what we mean here is that they engage in one or an array of cultural activities in French, and this could be anything from participating in shows, going to concerts in French, consuming the news, whether it be on TV or the radio in French. It could be reading books, novels in French, listening to music or podcasts in French. So most Anglophone Quebecers do engage in cultural activities in French, which once again is encouraging. If we look now at the findings from the qualitative component of the study, we first found that people's opinions appear to be informed by a variety of factors, notably their individual outlook. So this is their own personal way of seeing the world. Of course, that influences their perception about various linguistic groups in Quebec. People's opinions also appear to be informed by their direct personal experiences with the other linguistic group. So Anglophones' experiences in their day-to-day interactions with Francophones will influence their perception of Francophones and vice versa. And we also know that perceptions of the public discourse, so what people hear in the news, on the radio, or hear on TV, also influences their perception of the other linguistic group. So what Francophones hear about Anglophones influences their perception about them, and vice versa. So that's the first thing that we noticed in the focus groups. That's something that came out. Something else that came out in the focus groups is that Francophones tended to underestimate Anglophone Quebecers' ability to speak French, their use of the language, and their interest in French language culture. As one Francophone participant in our focus group stated, perhaps there are a lot of Anglophones who are indeed bilingual, but they often don't use their French, and that's why we don't hear it. So many Francophones in our focus groups were concerned about the long-term future of French in and outside of Quebec. Some participants from Montreal and Gatineau were especially frustrated at how much English they heard in their day-to-day lives. And that might have an impact on their estimation of how often Anglophones use French. As we saw a little bit earlier, we know that Anglophones do use French in an important facet of their life, and at least one important facet of their life. Okay, moving on to potential solutions here that came through in the qualitative component of the study. We found that even some of the more skeptical participants mentioned having positive personal interactions that had nuanced their view. So this is really important. This means that when Francophones had positive interactions with Anglophones, it nuanced their view about Anglophones, right? And vice versa as well. So those in-person interactions between Francophones and Anglophones in Quebec tend to have, for the most part, a positive impact on both linguistic groups' perception of one another. In addition, statistics on Anglophones' interest in the French language and English-speaking Quebecers' voices in the public sphere can help to overcome misconceptions about the English-speaking community. And English-speaking Quebecers can also be bridge builders when it comes to informing Anglophones elsewhere in Canada about Quebec and bilingualism. And I'll circle back to this notion of English-speaking Quebecers being bridge builders towards the end of the study. But really, the key idea here is that the English-speaking communities of Quebec understand bilingualism very well. Most of them live it on a daily, if not weekly basis, meaning that part of their life is in English and other parts of their life are in French. And it's in that way that they're really well placed, well positioned to explain to English-speaking Canada outside of Quebec the importance of bilingualism of the French language and Francophone culture, and really the importance of our country having two official languages, how that's a strength, that's something that's positive. Once again, I'll circle back at the end of the study to this point because we do have a quantitative component that relates to this. On that note, let's move on to the quantitative component of this study. We see here the proportion of each group, each linguistic group, Francophones and Anglophones, that interacted daily or weekly with the other. So 51% of Francophones interact either daily or weekly with Anglophones, and 76% of Anglophones interact either daily or weekly with Francophones. Now, this is perhaps normal, given that there are more Francophones than Anglophones in Quebec. So, of course, it's normal to see that there may be less Francophones that interact with Anglophones than vice versa. So nothing really surprising here. However, this is the slide that I think is really, really encouraging as well. It's that the proportion of each group that says that these interactions with the other are positive. So we just saw that most, or at least half of Francophones and most Anglophones interact either daily or weekly with the other linguistic group. And a large proportion of those people say that their interactions with the other linguistic group are positive. So 89% of Francophones say that their interactions with Anglophones are positive, and 81% of Anglophones say that their interactions with Francophones are positive. So once again, this is a large majority, and I think that this just reinforces the fact that on the individual level, Francophones and Anglophones in Quebec get along quite well. So that's really one of the takeaways of this study, because we saw it in the qualitative component. We're also seeing it here. We have here the proportion of each linguistic group that says most English mother tongue Quebecers can speak French. So here, 29% of Francophones agreed with this statement, whereas 58% of Anglophones agreed with this statement. Now, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, it's 71% of English mother tongue Quebecers that are bilingual. So what we see here, in fact, on behalf of both Francophones and Anglophones, even, is that there's an underestimation of the degree to which the English-speaking community of Quebec is bilingual. So, of course, we see here that this underestimation is stronger on behalf of Francophones than it is on behalf of Anglophones, which is somewhat natural. We would expect the English-speaking community to know more about itself than the Francophone community to know about the English-speaking community. But I think that globally, the takeaway here is that there is an underestimation to the extent to which the English-speaking community is bilingual. So this was surprising, and this may be attributed to persisting myths about the English-speaking community as a community that does not engage with the French language, that does not speak with using the French language, that does not engage with Francophone culture. Clearly, we see here that myth or that perception about the English-speaking community persists despite evidence to the contrary. This was another portion of the study here. So staying within the qualitative, or rather quantitative component, participants that were surveyed here were asked to answer either true or false to a statement that they were read. And in this case, these statements are all true. So, for example, most English mother tongue kids in Quebec are either in French schools or in French immersion. 79% of Anglophones agreed with this statement. They said it was true, which it is. And 44% of Francophones agreed with the statement, saying it's true. So we do see a little bit of a difference here of around 35% between the Francophone group represented in orange and the Anglophone group. Another statement that is also true is that in Quebec, most people with English as a mother tongue use French in their daily lives. As I mentioned earlier, this is true. 42% of Francophones got the correct answer here, whereas 73% of Anglophones got the correct answer. Another statement that holds true is the vast majority of Canadians outside of Quebec support the Official Languages Act. 44% of Francophones got this answer correct, and 64% of Anglophones got the answer correct. We know this to be true through public opinion research surveys. Now, for methodological reasons, the statements need to be true in some cases and false in other cases, just to ensure that we're getting people are not just answering true and getting all the answers correct. You need to kind of flip the answers around, like I said, for methodological reasons. So these statements are false. The correct answer here is false. For example, in Quebec, English mother tongue workers don't regularly use French at work. So 33% of Francophones answered false, which is the correct answer, and 62% of Anglophones answered false in this case as well, which is the correct answer. Another statement that was read to participants was, in Quebec, children from mixed marriages end up with English as a mother tongue instead of French. Once again, we know this to be true. 35% of Francophones got the correct answer here, and 54% of Anglophones got the correct answer. Another statement that was read to participants was, Anglophones in Quebec don't interact much with Francophones. As we saw a little bit earlier, this is false. Upwards of 70% of Anglophones interact with Francophones on either a daily or weekly basis. So 45% of Francophones answered false, and 62% of Anglophones answered false to the statement, which is the correct answer. And moving on here, it is rare for Anglophones in Quebec to take an interest in French language culture. 39% of Francophones got the correct answer, 51% of Anglophones got the correct answer. And finally, Canada's official bilingualism is more valued by Francophones than by Anglophones in Quebec. Once again, this statement is false. 22% of Francophones got the correct answer, and 48% of Anglophones got the correct answer. So what we see here globally is that, yes, Anglophones tended to get the correct answer more often than Francophones. So, this is kind of a situation where we could see the glass half full or a glass half empty. If we look at the glass half empty, we see that clearly, on behalf of Francophones especially, but also on behalf of Anglophones, there's more work to be done in terms of educating the community on educating Francophones and Anglophones, really all Quebecers, on the realities about the English-speaking communities and the level to which they engage with the French language and culture, as I said earlier. So that's really what needs to be improved. That's kind of seeing it as a glass half empty. If we look at the glass half full, there is a substantial portion of Francophones and a greater proportion of Anglophones who really do know facts about the English-speaking communities. So globally, I think that we could say that there's more work to be done. Yes, people need to know, we need to set the record straight about the English-speaking communities of Quebec, their engagement with French, the language, the culture. Having said that, we're not starting from scratch. There are perceptions that are starting to shift, that have been shifting over the past, I assume, decades, slowly but surely. What we know about perceptions is that they often persist in time, right? So it does take time to correct perceptions, especially outdated perceptions. And what this tells us is that there's more work to be done in that respect, although there's already a significant portion of the Francophone population and, of course, a greater proportion of the Anglophone population that know key facts about the English-speaking communities of Quebec. Moving on here, we have the proportion of each linguistic group that says that misconceptions between Anglophones and Francophones in Quebec are a problem. So 61% of Francophones thought this to be the case, and 67% of Anglophones think this to be the case as well. So clearly, misconceptions between Anglophones and Francophones in Quebec are a problem for the majority of people. I guess the next logical question is, what do we do to remedy this? How could we improve the situation? And so we have a couple of measures here that we proposed to Francophone and Anglophone participants in terms of things that could be done to help improve relations between Anglophones and Francophones, which I can mention are already quite positive in the majority of cases. But how could they be even better? Well, one measure that was put forward that received quite a bit of support from Anglophones and Francophones was to have more positive interactions via social activities, whether it be youth exchanges, clubs, partaking in making music together, playing sports together, etc. 89% of Francophones supported this, and 83% of Anglophones agreed that this measure could help improve relations between people of both linguistic groups in Quebec. So that actually received quite widespread support. Another measure that was presented to participants was to see Anglophones showing a greater interest in Francophone culture and being more present in Francophone media. So 82% of Francophones and 75% of Anglophones agreed that this measure could help improve relations between people of both linguistic groups beyond even more, I should say, than how positive they already are. Another measure that was put forward was publicizing more personal stories of Anglophones who embrace and speak French. 81% of Francophones and 76% of Anglophones, once again, thought that this would go a long way towards improving relationships between people of both linguistic groups in Quebec. And finally, publicizing more statistics showing that many Anglophones actually can and do speak French. So in this case, 78% of Francophones and 83% of Anglophones agreed that this would help improve relations. So we have here a number of different measures that people think globally will help further improve relationships between Anglophones and Francophones in Quebec. So, there are a number of different ways that we could tackle this issue of misconceptions or misperceptions about the English-speaking communities of Quebec. And circling back here to this notion of bridge builders, Anglophones or the English-speaking communities as bridge builders. So we have here the proportion of each linguistic group that agrees that Quebec Anglophones can be a bridge between Francophones from Quebec and Anglophones from elsewhere in Canada. 71% of Francophones agreed with this, and 77% of Anglophones agreed with this. So once again, this refers back to the notion of English-speaking Quebecers somewhat as ambassadors of the French language, of French culture, and of bilingualism in Canada, represented as ambassadors to the rest of English-speaking Canada, outside of Quebec, of course, to really present a positive view of the French language, of Francophone culture, and really that's what makes Canada Canada. It's a key part of our identity. I think we've seen that especially in the past couple of months, this national unity, this national identity that's coming around, and one of the key pillars of that national unity and identity is really the fact that we have two official languages, which really sets us apart from other countries. So it's nice to know that both Francophones and Anglophones agree with this notion of Anglophones in Quebec being a bridge builder between Quebec and the rest of Canada. And that's part of the reason why we named this study Building Bridges.
Has Bill 96 caused damage to bridge building?
Mm-hmm. So I will say that the survey and the focus groups were held in December of 2023, and the survey was conducted in January of 2024. So the data that we collected regarding, bilingualism of Quebecers, of English-speaking Quebecers, that dates back to the latest census and public opinion research surveys. But the second and third components, so the focus groups and the surveys were held obviously after Bill 96 was passed. So the data reflects obviously the passage of Bill 96 and the current situation. This is, like I said, it was published only a year ago, so this is still fairly relevant and up-to-date information. So has it changed? I mean, I suppose over the past year, I don't believe it's changed too much.
Such an important conversation, Alexandre. Thank you for being our guest today. We really appreciate it. Obviously, this is an ongoing conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, everyone.